Hello, good afternoon, happy Earth Day, and welcome to another live stream from the Natural History Museum. I'm Khalil Thurlaway. Today, we're going to be looking at humanity's relationship with nature, what needs to change, and what we could learn from the approaches of existing communities around the world. Today's event is part of a year-long program called Our Broken Planet, How We Got Here and Ways to Fix It, in which we explore the urgent challenges we all face while living in a planetary emergency, and approaches from around the world hoping to address them. This program combines live online content like this very show, articles and media on our website, and a brand new display opening up at the museum on the 21st of May, which is less than a month's time if you're watching this live. You can keep up to date with everything happening at the museum on our website and our social media channels. If you enjoy the show, please do consider making a donation if you can using the donate button next to the chat. We are a charity and community support is hugely important to us. One last thing before we begin, this event is for you. And we love having you part of the conversation. So if you're watching live, if you've got any questions or comments, please do pop them in the chat box and we'll come to as many as we can in the time we've got. Please do keep it polite though. We're here to have an open discussion about some really important issues. So without further ado, let's get going with today's conversation. Indigenous communities often face the realities of climate change first and hardest. Part of this is due to their generally closer relationships with their environments than settler industrialist societies. But it's also exacerbated by the challenges they already face from things like losing access to ancestral land and resources, as well as economic and political marginalization. They've also often developed extensive knowledge systems that have informed their relationships with nature for a long time. At a time when the whole world is facing an ecological crisis, can we learn from these practices and approaches to help build up a sustainable relationship with nature for us all going forward? Here to discuss this are Brianna Fruin and Archana Soreng. Brianna Fruin is a 22-year-old activist and environmental advocate for Samoa. At the age of 11, she became a founding member of 350.org Samoa and Future Rush, with the aim to promote youth and community engagement in climate change and sustainable issues. She's the youngest recipient of the Commonwealth Youth Award and the first ever youth ambassador chosen by the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program in recognition of her achievements in elevating the voice of young people in the Pacific. Archana Soreng is a 25-year-old Indigenous environmental activist of the Kharia Tribe of Odisha, India, who works to promote awareness of traditional knowledge and practices of Indigenous communities in regards to climate change. She's one of 7 members of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change and is a research officer for the advocacy group Vasundhara Odisha, highlighting the critical role that forests play in sustaining rural livelihoods. So, welcome to the show, Brianna and Archana. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's pretty late where you both are, so we really appreciate you making the time for us. Hi there.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Hi, Khalil, and hi, Brianna. So happy to be here on this Earth Day.
I'm really looking forward to seeing what where this conversation goes. But before we get into the large global issues, let's start by getting a picture of you and your communities. So let's start with Brianna. Why don't you introduce us to yourself and your community?
Thank you. I'm from the island of Samoa, which is a cluster of islands in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean. And so whenever I introduce myself, I always say talofa, which is hello in Samoan. And I think that's really important to me because my language and my culture and my heritage is really important to me. Being island raised is it's really the reason why I do climate work, because of the reality that the climate crisis has on my islands. And if you could see Samoa, you would know why I'm so passionate about protecting it. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth. It's a very biased opinion. But we have crystal clear waters, like just stunning waterfalls, real green and lush gardens. And this beach that's shown on the screen is only like half an hour away from where I grew up. And so this was literally in my backyard growing up. And so growing up around this environment and growing up in a village culture where you know everyone, and you get to go to the shop and know the lady who's selling you bread and the man who made the bread and the other 5 aunties buying the bread. That's just the village I grew up in. And that type of island life and island culture and island environment has made me the person I am, and I'm very proud to be village made.
And how does that island environment, how does that influence the kind of the your community's relationship with where you live?
Oh yes, our culture would not be the same without the acknowledgement of land. And so there's a concept in Samoan culture that's very important, and it's called the va. And what the va means is the space between. But in Samoan culture, we don't see space between people as an empty place. We actually see it as a connection. And so I have a va with you, Kala. I have a va with you, Archana. And it's not something that separates us, but it's something that connects us. And there's spirituality there, and there's connection there that must be tended to. And so it speaks a lot to relationships and how relationships have to be constantly looked after. But in Samoan culture, this va goes beyond human to human. We believe that we also have a va with nature. And so every tree you may see, every grain of sand on our beaches, we have a relationship with it. And just like how we must tend to our relationships with our friends and with our family and humans, we must also constantly tend to our relationship with nature. And so this is the way that we're raised as Indigenous people. And what we know to be true is that the climate crisis is a result of this va between human and nature being broken. And so a lot of my passion is behind how do I mend, or how do I help mend this va?
And I guess an example of that relationship would be the sea. So, for example, the sea is often seen, especially by, for example, I grew up in London. So, I see the sea generally as this big gap between places that you can go. Whereas it sounds like, the sea is much more of an active connector and a thing that you have a relationship with rather than just a barrier.
100%.
And Archana, what's your community's kind of relationship with where you live and where you grew up?
Yeah. So talking about my community, like I come from Kharia Tribe. So I'll start talking about my name first. So my name is Archana Soreng. So the meaning of my surname in my Kharia Tribe language means rock. So it's that, that you're so intertwined with nature that even your name has the element of nature. And that is why we say nature is a source of identity, culture, and tradition. And sorry, and then we have other tribes, like we have surnames like Kullu, which means tortoise. We have surnames called Ba, which means paddy. We have surnames like Kiro, which means tiger. So the indigenous communities or the tribal groups, those who are here in my area, that name itself symbolizes that how deeply they are connected with nature. And talking about my family, my personal story, my own grandfather was pioneer of community-led forest protection practices. So in my village, my grandfather brought together all the village communities of our own village and our nearby village, and together they decided that we will be protecting our forest. And he believed that it is only when we have a sustained relationship with nature we will be able to survive. And this passed on to my father's generation. And my father was an indigenous healthcare practitioner. So by formal education, if I see, he was not a doctor, but he got those indigenous healthcare practices through his ancestor, through his uncle, through his father. And that is how I have seen growing up my father giving medicines to communities made out of roots, leaves. And especially my father was uh, giving medicines for snake bites. So living in this atmosphere and living in this entire environment of village, I was like super happy that wow, which is so much greenery, so much of community way of living. Because in my community it is like morning you get up, it's not one person doing one work of household or agriculture or things like that. It's a community approach wherein everyone together is going to the forest collecting food, everyone is together going to the agriculture paddy lands, everyone is coming back home in the evening singing song, rejoicing, and all about nature. So it's not only about the action, it is also about our language, our culture, and tradition. And having said that, I strongly remember both of my parents had told me that if you really want to make changes and contribute towards our community, you have to be into policy making. And I feel that is what inspired me, that my own personal experience, my access to education, and my work with the indigenous communities here made me realize that how we indigenous communities over the years have been victims of colonization, inferiorization, and systematic racism, wherein we are made to believe that you are backward, you are savage, you do not know anything, you do not have the right to speak, and your practices are very backward, and you need to adopt a different worldview of practices or way of living. And this made me realize that it is very important that we indigenous youth need to go back to our community members. And this struck me very hard when I lost my father in 2017, that our elders are not will not be with us for long, so is our leaders. Now is the time we need to go back. If our generation does not preserve our culture and tradition, nothing will be left for the upcoming generation. And that is why I'm here today advocating for the rights of indigenous communities.
Yeah, and I think that it's really interesting what you raise about the lasting effects of colonialism on communities, and how that can, that's something that you almost need to undo before you can then build and spread that knowledge and approach. Brianna, have you encountered anything similar in your work?
Yes, definitely. I feel like learning is hard, but unlearning is even harder. And that's been something that I've had to actively do. I mean, even just trying to get into the climate space, I felt like it wasn't a place for me, because like in my colonial like type of thinking, people who looked after the planet, people who were like on those boats that saved whales, they were all white. If you Google climate activists, you'll see mostly white faces. And so even just starting out in this space, I had to decolonize my way of thinking and unpack a lot of like internalized racism I had towards myself, and start to instill in my mind, like, I am worthy to be a part of this movement, and I do have answers, and I do have a lot to contribute to fighting for climate justice.
And I think that's something that might resonate with some of our viewers, that this, it seems like, well, it's obvious that you two are on this, on your journeys and trajectories that have, and we'll come to this later, have taken you to some really kind of big influential places. But this journey starts at a personal level, and then a community, and then building from there. So moving on from that personal level, maybe we can look at the community. So let's look at some of the examples of how climate change and the climate emergency is affecting the communities you represent, and how they've dealt with it. Archana, are there any specific examples of that come to mind of that illustrate that kind of dynamic?
Yeah, so I would like to share, what are the eco-friendly practices or community-led forest protection practices in our area and in our region, where the tribes here have been practicing, and then would like to emphasize that how it is being impacted. So, like starting with uh, like food. Food is something which we all like to eat, but where do we eat our food is very important. Like, for example, our tribes, my tribes, my grandmother, my family members, everyone has been eating our foods in the leaf plates, and these leaves are sustainably plucked by our own grandmothers, uncles, and aunts, wherein, all the community members from our village are going together, singing songs, collecting leaves, and coming back and together sitting and talking about our histories, culture, and tradition, and making those leaf plates. So, these leaf plates are an alternative to plastic pollution, or these leaf plates are alternative to existing disposable utensils which we find, which are causing plastic pollution. And along with this, these leaf plates are collected sustainably, plus these leaf plates are so disposable, like, it is biodegradable. So one thing which I feel important is this is so unique, and this is inherited in our culture, and this is one of the efforts. And the second efforts which I say that my grandmother, I have seen her making mats out of date leaves. And those mats which are made out of date leaves, it takes a lot of time to make, but then, it's all about giving time to make the sustainable products rather than buying things which are unsustainable and which are causing problems. But so I feel so good that these mats are not only used for sitting, but it is also used for our cultural practices, in ceremonies like marriage, and also in the ceremonies where we are having death in our family. So these mats are treated as sacred, which is made by our own grandmothers and aunts. And then we also have brooms, wherein, our community members go together to make to collect these broomsticks from the forest. And this again, a broom is also made by a hand, or by, by my grandmother, my mothers. So all these things are again sustainable products, or sustainable an eco-friendly way of living. And at the same time, I would also like to move on to our agriculture practices. Like, when I talk about agriculture practices, people see it's about, production of food, or production of whether it is vegetables and things like that. For us indigenous communities, it's not mere, production which we are getting from the land, but it is kind of more deep relationship with land, wherein, land is blessing us with food to eat and supporting us. So all this, wherein, it's not again one person going to grow a paddy, but it is the entire community together going to paddy. And I remember in my childhood days, we sing, we dance, and we go to the land to grow paddy. So it's again that, so much of deep connection with the nature when we go. And that is why when we are talking about, these days people talk about organic farming, then I feel this organic farming and this sustainable farming has been there long back in our communities members. It's, I feel that these terms are again hijacked by the modern developmental contemporary era. And apart from that, as you can see in the screen, is, a house made out of mud. So while growing up, this is the home where I used to stay. And I used to see that, when I came out to city for accessing my education, I used to see buildings, huge buildings with, made out of bricks, cement, and lot of manufacturing things. And I just realized that, oh, these people are very rich, so they have so big houses, and we are very poor, so we live in mud houses. Is, I felt, because it's a sign that we are backward. But now when I have decolonized my mind, now when I have accessed education, now I realized, amazing. We live in mud house. It's the super eco-friendly house because you don't need fans, you don't need coolers, you don't need AC because the mud itself has so cold breeze that you feel so cool. And the tiles which is there, which you can see in the pictures also, it is so cool when it is summer. It is very warm when it is summer. It is very cool when it is summer, and when it is very warm when it is winter. So it is itself also shows that how our indigenous communities traditional knowledges practices of infrastructure building was so unique and eco-friendly. But now I have realized the schemes which are coming up with the government or the world leaders of making house for the indigenous people, it is putting them in a vicious circle of poverty. Because now when you shift into different housing patterns of building infrastructure, it is hot, you need fans, you need coolers, you need AC, and for that matter, you need electricity to that. And for that electricity, you need bills to pay for that electricity. So, talking about how we used to live in a most eco friendly way of living, but how over the years it has been demeaned and it has been told that, indigenous communities are very backward and needs to be taught how to live. But now I realize that we have been living a very eco-friendly way of life and contributing it, because the carbon footprint of all this and the carbon sequestration of all this is so low. And by protecting forest, my community members, indigenous community members, are the ones who are most cost effectively storing carbon in the forest, in the land. So those things needs also to be realized. So I'll just show one of the another images wherein the women are protecting the forest. So I came across this practices called Thenga Pali. So Thenga means stick. So the stick which they are holding is called Thenga, and Pali means turn. So over the 30 to 40 years, these women have been protecting the forest. Why did they start protecting the forest? Because 30 to 40 years back, there was lot of timber mafias because of industrialization and globalization, and those timber mafias entirely cut and destroyed the forest. Now when men used to go to protect the forest, because men and timber mafia used to have conflict, tussle, fight amongst them, because it's men together coming and fighting with each other. So then men again saying, no, we need women to come in front. So if there is women, because stronger laws for women, so women will protect the forest. And at one point of time, women just realized, are we there to just safeguard you from being, beaten or by the timber mafias, or protect you? If we are protecting the forest, we need decision making powers. We need rights over our forest. And that is why, since then, women asserted, and till now 30 to 40 years, every day women are going to protect the forest. Every day women are going to patrol the forest. Now the question is, why women are going to patrol the forest? Because for women, the forest is like the child. So they are taking care of the child, and they feel that when they grow old, the women, the forest will again take care of them, like the child take care of the mother. So it's again that divine relationship which they have. And the thing which is very important is that they rotate this practice, like 4 women going today, and then they'll keep the sticks in front of the next community's houses, and they will go on the next day. So in this way, the entire village is taking the responsibility of the protecting the forest. And thereby now, because of this 40 years of community led forest practices, the entire area has rejuvenated. Earlier, because of deforestation, when it was rain, there was land segment getting settled down on agriculture fields, which was making it more fertile. And that is which was making it more infertile, because when it's rain, soil erosion, soil is coming on the agricultural land and it is becoming barren. So all these things are now not happening, because indigenous women are in the forefront leading this battle of climate action and protecting. Last thing I'll say and end my intervention is that, don't you think that women are taking a lot of burden? Every day they are making food, taking care of the family, taking care of the kids, cleaning the houses, and then going to protect forest. and then coming back in the evening and again doing the household work. This is the problem, that numerous work is being done by indigenous communities and indigenous women for that matter, but those labors are unrecognized. And why, the question is, why communities are doing this? They are doing it because of the sheer love and compassion and relationship with nature. What can the world do for them? The world can merely do this, recognize their rights, respect their traditional knowledge and practices, and make them integral part of decision making. We have that concept of who are experts. We feel educated people are experts. I do not believe that. For me, the women in the village with whom I interact, who has no formal education, is expert in terms of biodiversity conservation and climate action. So let us move beyond the binaries of education, educated, non-educated, expertise, rather than respect and uh, acknowledge the frontliners, the guardians of the forest, the indigenous communities.
And I think the results speak for themselves when as you said, when communities are allowed to mobilize and exercise their built up knowledge and experience in the relationship with their environment. As you said, in that example with the forest rejuvenating after decades of care from the community, it's really important to acknowledge and support these community efforts. Brianna, have you got any input on this? What about your community? Obviously, island communities very much at the forefront of the climate emergency.
Yeah, first off, like, I'm so grateful for everything Archana has shared, and I think she brought up such important points about the way we should be looking at sustainability. I think there's a big misconception that as like a human race that we're trying to get to sustainability, when like the reality is we need to be getting back to sustainability, and the people who know how to do this are indigenous communities. And I experienced the same thing like growing up as you, sis. Like, I used to think that like the houses in like my villages were so behind, and I used to be like so excited to see like these big buildings going up. And then, like, exactly as you said, and when I decolonized my mind, I realized, wow, the way that my people actually live is actually futuristic. Like, I think that there will be a big shift in mindset, especially now, when the climate crisis is so hot on the global agenda, that we'll need to be going back into the villages and seeing how they've been living sustainably, and trying to, marry indigenous knowledge with scientific solutions. And I think that's where we will find a lot of the progress that we're needing to make. But to go back to your question, Carl, like trying to answer it a little bit quickly, a big thing for island communities is the impact climate has had on our relationship with the ocean. And so, we grew up loving the ocean, being near it. The ocean is in almost every Psalm 1 song and in every Psalm 1 dance. So the photo you see is actually a dance that my friend taught me called Lupe Olefo Anga, and it actually tells the story of the ocean. And so we're literally on the ocean, singing about the ocean while doing a dance about the ocean. And so that's how interconnected our culture is with land and with the environment. And we can look at ourselves as victims of this crisis and think like, oh wow, we're the drowning islands, we're the people who are going to lose their culture, who's going to lose their land. Or we can reshift that narrative and feel like we're actually climate warriors. Like, no, we're not going to say we're drowning. We're actually going to say that we're fighting. And we're not going to feel sorry for ourselves that, we might lose these dances. We're actually going to use these dances to teach younger kids about climate change. And so that's what me and my friends did. The three of us, we used this dance that talked about how to take care of the environment to go into schools in rural villages in Samoa and teach kids about climate change. And so we integrated adaptation messages. How can you adapt to the village when there's a cyclone. Like, what do you need to do if there's a natural disaster, if there's a flood? And then how can you be a climate warrior? And we taught all of these lessons through dance. And so, a lot of these kids who were thinking that they were victims of a crisis were now changing their minds and thinking, oh, actually, we are warriors of this crisis, and we have a lot of the solutions. And exactly what Archana said, that Indigenous people have a lot of the answers that we need to adapt and to mitigate this broken planet.
And you and the other the other campaigners that you work with, as well as Archana, you're really embodying that kind of agency and really taking that message to the greatest extent, as we'll explore later in our conversation. But for now, we've got some comments and questions from our audience, so I think we might be interesting to share. So Sylvia on Facebook has said, such honest and eye-opening answers. Thank you so much for sharing. It's important. She agrees that it's important to protect ancestral culture and also knowledge, no matter where we are in the world. We have a question from, don't have a name here, but we do have a question from one of our viewers asking, and I think this kind of relates to your point earlier, Brianna, about marrying Indigenous knowledge with new research and science. Do you think countries in the global West or the global North have lots to learn from Indigenous and First Nation cultures in regards to ecologically sustainable or ecologically friendly tools and products? And I mean, I guess we'd expand that by saying, what do you think the next innovation should be? We'll start with Brianna and then we'll go to Archana.
Yes, this is such a good question, because I do believe that is, like I said, the spot where we need to be at, where we are taking and utilizing Indigenous knowledge to, I guess, inform us of steps forward. And like one of the great examples of this is the fact that Tokelau, which is a small island in the Pacific, was the first country in the world to go 100% renewable energy. And the way that they did this is that they took science that came from a lot of the renewable energy sectors that were happening in the West, and they took that knowledge back to Tokelau, this small island, and they got traditional knowledge holders there to consult on these engineers' work on trying to get the country run on solar power. And they were able to marry those two knowledges together and then create this sustainable way of giving this island energy. And so Tokelau, a lot of people don't know this, but they're actually leading the way in renewables. And that has come out of Indigenous knowledge and modern technological solutions.
That's really fascinating to see. Archana, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I just would like to share about the literatures, those who are out there, that, one thing is very important to understand is that every tribe or every indigenous community is very unique. And whether it is they are from different geographical location of the countries, of the world. But what connects them is their traditional knowledge and practices and relationship with nature. So when we are talking with these practices, and when we are talking about, how how countries from the global north can learn from that. So I think it is first would require identification of these practices and what this indigenous communities members are doing there. And I think there are numerous reports already there who are documenting what are the practices which indigenous communities are there. So one, it is to support it. And the second thing which would be very important when in terms of how countries can do that is through ensuring that the developmental policies which is coming is not destroying these practices, because often it is not supporting, rather creating more problems. So we request and wo appeal is that countries need to respect, acknowledge, and promote the traditional knowledge of practices rather than coming with laws and policies which have adversely impact on the indigenous communities.
Yeah, and I guess a contributing factor to that is that in the systems that we use to determine what is important or what is valuable, for the most part in modern society, it tends to be things that you can put an immediate number on, especially an immediate financial number on, and understanding that the value of knowledge and the value of practices and the value of relationships is more than just a line on a spreadsheet. And we've got some other amazing comments and questions that we'll get to after the next section, because I think they'd be really good to explore after we've talked about what we're next going to look at. So we've looked at how this works at an individual and a community level. But a big part of the work that both of you do is not just making sure that your communities are represented, but also trying to integrate some of the knowledge and approaches that form these relationships with nature into international policy. How do you see this relationship working between Indigenous and First Nation peoples and international governing bodies? We'll start with Brianna, then we'll go to Archana. And what's your experience been so far as well?
Yeah, I think an experience, or I guess something that I've had the chance to witness is I'm based in New Zealand. So I'm from Samoa, but I'm studying here in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and the Indigenous community here is Tangata Whenua Māori people. And a big part of their culture, similarly to all Indigenous cultures, is the belief that, I referred to this earlier, that there's a vibe between human and nature, and that different elements of nature are living and breathing things. And so something that got implemented into policy here was one of our rivers was given personhood. And so this river was recognized as a living, breathing person. And so if someone were to violate the sacredness of this river, that you could be charged for it. And so this is such a beautiful example of how we can protect our rivers, our mountains, our sacred places, and our areas of great importance and in need of conservation. And how can we put this type of protection into policy? And the way that we were able to do this, or New Zealand was able to do this, was through consultation with Indigenous people. And I think that is just one of the hopefully many ways that we'll start seeing Indigenous people influence policy in positive ways.
And this idea of legal personhood for natural entities like rivers and mountains, it might seem alien or strange to some of our viewers, but in industrial cultures, we already do this to a certain extent with things like corporate personhood. So a company can be legally a person, which affords that company all of the rights and protections that a person has. So if we can do that to a company that doesn't really physically exist and afford those protections, surely it's even more valuable to ascribe that to something that is part of the living environment and part of the system that we're part of.
Yeah.
Archana, have you encountered any uses of natural personhood in your work?
I strongly feel is that one thing which I have realized is specifically in terms of the indigenous communities is that they embrace you with lot of hospitality. And when I have interacted with people, reached out to the people, being from the indigenous communities, they have always welcomed me and shared with me the challenges and struggles which they are facing, and about also their way of living. But what I realized is that for that, to understand what is happening with my community members across, you need to step out. You need to go and meet them. And that is what is very important at this current arena, wherein communication and reaching out to people is very important. And the second thing which I have realized in terms of reaching out to communities or amplifying the voice, that it is not my story, it is the community's story. And it is not a single person's story or history. It is the story of the entire community or the entire region. And that has to be always kept in mind. I'm saying this because, often when policies are made, often when struggles are discussed, often when challenges are spoken about, yes, we do have personal challenges, we do have personal struggles, but it is way, way more beyond than the community struggle. And that is, it's way beyond the struggle which ancestors had have. And it is a historical injustice and historical struggle. And I believe it will take years to undo that. But what is important for us as an indigenous youth is to work on that way, lead that way. And what we call upon from the international community is solidarity and respecting the indigenous people's worldview. The word worldview is very important, because every now and then there is so many worldview existing in this contemporary era, and every worldview just feels and wants to dominate the other worldview. At this juncture, it is very important that we respect the indigenous worldview. We realize there's another worldview which has that another way of living with the indigenous communities, and this will only come when you interact with them, when you reach out to them, because you may read about it, but your personalized interaction with the indigenous people will give you way, way more beyond warmth and love for the nature and the community members.
And how has that relationship worked when you've tried to kind of integrate that into discussions at very, very kind of high international kind of governmental settings? So, for example, your work with the United Nations and things like that.
I truly believe that one thing which is connected me with the indigenous communities across, or the communities which I have interacted, is that, again, as I earlier said, that we are different in terms of our geographical location, but we are connected with our struggles, we are connected with our relationship with nature. And that is what gives me strength to stand and advocate, and give me the courage to speak in front of the world leaders that this is what indigenous people's worldview is, and this is what indigenous people are facing, and this is what indigenous people demand. And the fact that it's not that we are doing it now, we have been doing it for years. Our relationship with nature is so divine and so pure, but this developmental worldview has broken that relationship, and we want to go back and revive those relationships. But more than us, it is you who want this relationship to be revived, because now you have realized that we indigenous people are very important in this entire discourse of climate action. You need us, so as the world, and we are willing to support you, we are willing to work together. But for that, you need to acknowledge our existence, you need to give us those decision making spaces. And when I say it's decision making spaces, it's not just mere ticking box, that you bring in the indigenous people just for the sake of token participation, but ensuring that the indigenous people are part of the entire climate action process, recovery process, resilience process, adaptation process, from beginning till end, from designing till evaluation and monitoring.
And that kind of that interaction between kind of community level and international governmental level, I think is a really important thread that has come out through a lot of what we've talked about today. And that also ties into what one of our viewers has asked. C. has asked, they really like the way of looking at, but Brianna's statement of looking at the threats that you face as communities and as a planet proactively and really kind of taking action. And are there any lessons that either of you can share, or tips that you can give for people being able to, at an individual or community level, to take action that can give people agency in being part of fixing our relationship with nature? We'll start with Brianna, then we'll go to Archana.
Yeah, that's such a great question. For me, when I think about the position we're in, I try and stay away from thinking that we're at the end of something, because I believe that we are actually at the beginning of change and we're not at the end of disaster, that we're actually just starting this journey of getting, I guess, mankind to somewhere not only more sustainable, but more just. And I think that there's so many intersectionalities with how broken our world is. Because when I think about our broken planet, I don't just think about how broken our environment is. I think about how broken mankind is. And it's not lost on me that, today on Earth Day, I couldn't find myself to write anything about Earth Day because I was so heartbroken about what has been happening in America with Black Lives Matter. And I don't think that those two issues of trying to find Black liberation and also trying to find climate justice is separate, because they're both symptoms of a system of colonization and capitalism. And so for me, I'm always remaining hopeful, because I think that solving the climate crisis is also solving all these other injustices, and that we can actually decide here and now that the world is in great need of changing and shifting. And what that would take is completely reimagining the world we know. And that includes, like we spoke earlier of, is decolonizing, of changing, of going back to indigenous solutions, of valuing, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And if we're able to get ourselves back to those values and protecting the vow we have with nature and with people, like protecting the vow we have with our neighbors, no matter what color or religion they are, we can find ourselves at the beginning of something better than we've ever had as a human race.
And those changes you're talking about, those, I assume that you mean that those have to occur from the very smallest scale on an individual level all the way up to the very biggest scale, because it's shortcomings at those scales that have got us into the situation that we're in. And it's only, if we try and only address the large scale or only address the individual scale, we'll never really get to a solution, will we?
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes actually is a Jay-Z quote, and he says that people always blame society, but we are society. And I think that's something we forget about too with politicians. Like, we always blame politicians, but we vote politicians in. And so I think we need to start, switching our mindset. And when we try and blame like the bigger systems, we have to remind ourselves that we're a part of these systems. We're funding these systems. We're giving these systems power. So in fact, we're the ones with the power. People have the power. Individuals have the power.
That's really heartening to hear. Archana, have you got anything to add on that?
The one thing which I feel what people can do, or what can be learned from the indigenous communities, or how we can mend our relationship with the planet, and how we can mend our broken relationship. I think one thing would be very important is to prioritize health of nature before development and greed, is one thing which I feel. And when I say this, it is also emphasizing that, we need to hold the world leaders accountable for not bailing out polluting industries. And at the same time, also, we need to, on a personal level, need to be conscious of our consumptions. So all in all, it is that we all need to strive and prioritize justice and health of both nature and people. And this needs to be the founding stone as we move ahead towards climate action, and as a founding stone of this decade of action towards the climate action.
And I think that those are really great principles that hopefully that answers your question, C dot at home, and hopefully those are things that people can consider and use as a springboard to try and start thinking about start thinking about your individual relationship with the world, both in terms of people and nature. We've got another question that's come in earlier. Let me find that. Sorry, it's disappeared on the chat. I'm going to have to come back to that question. But Archana, a few minutes ago, you were talking about representation at these kind of international levels. How have you found that so far? Has it been a satisfying experience, or have there been frustrations?
Yeah, I think there has been all kinds of moment. There has been moments of satisfaction when, when you have raised voice, when you have raised concerns, when you have advised to certain policies and it has been accepted, it is acted upon. So you feel happy and satisfied. But there are times when your voices are just listened, not acted upon. And that is where you feel disheartened that, it's not working, people are not taking us seriously. But then ultimately what I feel is important is constant engagement, and constant engagement is what is important in this entire discourse of climate action, because it's all about continuing doing things, continuing demanding things, continuing to working in a more constructive way and in a more unique way. Because one thing I have just realized these days is, the power of art, the power of music, entertainment, and for that media, if I talk about social media in terms of this entire climate action discourse, that, how there has been a social media movement going in terms of the climate action discourse. But however, I also recognize and acknowledge that, when we are talking about social media, there has been also barriers of language, there has been barriers of network issue, internet issues. So all in all, what is important is to realize the loopholes which is there and to act upon it. Because one thing in terms of language which I feel is, a lot of time our community members are not able to access in this international spaces or policy making spaces, or for that matter consultation and dialogue, because there is no interpretation. And because of these language barriers, it is very very important that enabling environment is created, that there is translation of the resources, there is interpretation. And apart from that, I also feel that special emphasis needs to be to prioritize and bring people from the grassroots levels. It has to be both locally, globally, and nationally.
And it's an interesting point you make there about about the barriers that are put up between indigenous populations and access to policy, because there is, like you said, there is often quite a lot of talk about involving and engaging communities, but as soon as it becomes difficult, like they realize that we might need an interpreter, or there might be other challenges, suddenly it becomes less of a priority. Brianna, do you think there's a way that we can try and keep proper community engagement as a top priority for these types of things?
Yeah, I think there's a way that we can even do that on an individual level. I think that we can get so caught up just as like human beings of always wanting to talk and always wanting to like take space, where I think it's so important like to be able to self-evaluate and think, is my voice the best voice for this space? And I have to do that with myself too, like acknowledging my privileges. I can speak English. I'm university educated, and I'm a woman of color, but I'm light skinned as well. And so there are spaces sometimes that I prohibit my own people from entering because I'm taking the mic. And I think we all can find ourselves in these situations where we have to kind of acknowledge the privileges that we do hold and think, oh, actually, can I use my privilege to say, actually, I will take this mic, but then I will give it to my brother or sister who I think could add something very valuable or could contribute something great to this discussion. And I think we can actively do that, just constantly being self-aware of the time and the space we take up, and, being proactive in sharing that.
I think that's the idea of sharing the limelight, sharing the mic, I think fits in really well with a lot of the community aspects that we've been talking about. And I'm afraid that's the end of the time that we've come to, but I think that's a really nice place to wrap up. And I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. I hope that our audience have found this as fulfilling and informative as I have. Thank you so much, and I wish you both the best in all your future efforts. There should be a link coming up in the chat to social media accounts for both Brianna and Archana, and as well as the Pacific Climate Warriors, I think. So do check those out. Thank you so much, guys. And thank you very much for joining us at home as well. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Once again, massive thanks for anyone who's donated. If you do enjoy the show, please do consider making a donation. It's much appreciated, and it helps us keep bringing you content like this. We've got more shows coming up in the Our Broken Planet series. Keep an eye on our website and social channels. There should be a link in the chat. The next show is on the 19th of May, where we'll be in conversation with Dr. Tara Garnett and Dr. Julia Shaw about the relationship between our food and the environment. In the meantime, there's a ton of other talks, shows, and videos on our YouTube channel. And you can stay up to date with what's going on at the museum on our Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook pages, as well as our website at nhm.ac.uk. Until then, I'm Khalil Thurlaway. That was Archana Soreng and Brianna Fruin, and this has been Reshaping Our Relationship with Nature from the Natural History Museum. Goodbye and happy Earth Day.